We are very excited to have with us this morning the leaders of the House and the Senate of the Minnesota Legislature for taking the time to be here. Obviously, all of you find this to be very important given how many of you are here. So this is going to be a great panel. So let me start. I'm just going to introduce them, and they can come up as I do so. First, we have Senate Majority Leader Tom Bakk. Senator Tom Bakk returns as the Senate Majority Leader for this session. He was first elected to the House in 1994. He has served 4 terms before being elected to the Senate in 2002 and is serving his 4th Senate term representing District 3. He is a retired labor official and received his BA at the University of Minnesota Duluth. So Senator Bakk, if you want to join us up here, thank you very much. All right, next we have the Speaker of the House is with us today, Representative Paul Thissen. Speaker Thissen was elected to the House in 2002, re-elected in 2012 to serve a 5th term representing the people and business in District 61B. He is an attorney. He has his law degree from the University of Chicago and his undergrad at Harvard University. Thank you very much, Speaker, if you want to join us. We also have House Minority Leader Kurt Daudt. Representative Daudt was elected by his Republican caucus as Minority Leader. He was elected to the House in 2010 and re-elected in 2012 by the constituents of District 31A. He is a business manager and has a degree in aviation management from the University of North Dakota. So Representative Daudt, join us, please. Thank you. All right, so let me go ahead. Senator Hann, I will introduce him, and as soon as he hears, he will come up here, and maybe Senator Bakk, you've probably been on enough panels with Senator Hann. Maybe we could have you answer the question first as yourself, and then as Senator Hann.
On his behalf?
Yes. I think we actually had one year where we had Speaker Thissen and Representative Zeller's switch answering for each other one year here, so that was.
Here he is.
Senator Hann. Good, because I could not kill the time anymore. All right, thank you very much, Senator Hann. So let me go back. Senator David Hann was elected by his caucus to serve as Senate Minority Leader. First elected in 2002, now serving his 4th term representing District 48. He's a business process consultant, had his degree from Gustavus Adolphus and also graduate studies from the University of Chicago. So Senator Hann, thank you very much for being here with us this morning. Sounds like you've been very busy already this morning. So let's jump in. I'm going to start with a question that none of you is going to be surprised by, the business community first question. But obviously an immediate priority for the business community is the repeal of the business-to-business taxes. This is obviously time sensitive because the warehouse tax goes into effect on April 1st. So do you support a repeal of these taxes, and will it be addressed early in session? And Senator Bakk, we're going to start with you on that.
Well, I'm not going to say whether I support it or not because it will be totally contingent upon how much money we have available in the February forecast. February 28th we'll get the numbers, but it certainly is something that will be in the mix with other considerations. I do have to tell you there are still some accounting measures that were used during the last 12 years in order to keep the state's budget in balance when we had structural budget problems that still need to be paid back before we really get the state's books squared. And those of you that are retailers will understand this. Things like the June accelerated sales tax, where we ask you to estimate your June sales tax collections and pay that into the state before you've even made some of those sales. That is one of the accounting gimmicks that still is out there. It's well north of $100 million. Those kind of measures need to be fixed, and there are a number of them. So there are a lot of other things that are business tax related like that that will also be under consideration.
And Senator Hann, we're just going to go down the line on this question.
Thank you. I would say yes, I do favor that. I think it's going to be a priority for our caucus. We think that there was a lot of discussion about these issues in the lead up to the special session, and at that time the governor and others talked about that it would be something that we could do if there were funds available in the so-called surplus, which We had in November, the forecast shows that there are sufficient funds to do this. Historically, there's not a lot of difference between the November forecast and the February forecast, so I don't suspect there's going to be a significant change. And assuming that's the case, then yes, we are very much interested, and we think it ought to be the top priority. We talk about an unsession. Let's undo those taxes first thing.
Speaker.
Yes.
Perfect. We'll get through a lot more questions that way.
I agree, and it is a huge priority for our caucus. I'm glad to hear the Speaker agrees that we want to repeal those as well. So we look forward to doing that early in session.
Great. Let's talk a little bit, staying more on the surplus. It's always, I think people are feeling comfortable that February 28th, we are going to see a surplus. It's always good. Some would say easier, but I would say sometimes it's more challenging when there's a surplus. Lots of different things to do with that. I heard this morning on NPR, I think all four of you were referenced in this about the surplus and reserves, and there's some legislation out there about increasing the reserves. So what do you think, presuming we're going to have a surplus, what is it that we should be doing with that money? Senator Hann, let's start with you.
Well, I think the first priority ought to be to repay the surplus to the people who paid it, the taxpayers who paid the money. I think what it represents is that we have increased the taxes in the state budget, we've increased the spending, and on top of all that, we've got about $1 billion more than that required. We ought to return that in some form or another, and the business-to-business taxes would be a part of that. There might be other things we could do. Conformity with federal tax law, for example, might be another thing, or some of the things that Senator Bakk has in mind. Those are things that we ought to look at doing. I have heard some discussion about maybe we ought to expand the size of the reserves. We have, I think, in total about $1 billion in reserves of various kinds that are available to the state. I look at that as money that is there to provide us if we have cash flow needs or if there are emergency kinds of needs. I've heard, though, other people talk about we need to have a reserve that will sort of recession-proof state government. I don't think that's a good idea, to try to say, well, when we have a downturn in the economy and maybe revenues are a little bit softer than what they were before, that everybody else has to make adjustments, but state government doesn't. The kind of spending that we've proposed is going to be protected from that because we'll have reserves large enough to sustain that. I'm not sure that's good policy, and I hope that's not what we do.
So, Speaker, where are our reserves? Do you think they need to be bolstered, and then what would you suggest with the surplus money?
Well, the reserve, I suppose you can always put more into reserves, but that would not be my priority. I think, again, the taxes we talked about initially, the House actually passed federal conformity in 2013, last year, as part of our tax bill. So we think that that's a priority quite clearly as well. And for a lot of businesses, especially the accountants here, you understand the challenges that not conforming brings and the cost that it brings to a lot of businesses. So we think that those two things are important. There, I think, is fairly significant bipartisan consensus about one spending item, and that is in the area of long-term people that work in the long-term care industry, but not in nursing homes. Nursing homes got an increase in the last session, and I think that there's pretty broad bipartisan consensus that we ought to help the folks in the long-term care industry that don't work in nursing homes. That industry largely is driven by government spending. That's where most of that's where most of the money to that industry comes from. So I think we need to address that issue. I think another thing that we ought to pay attention to is we are moving forward with teacher evaluation, which I think also has bipartisan support, but it does put some pressure on our school districts to spend money on that instead of on the classroom, and I think we could put some more money into supporting the teacher evaluation system in the state to make sure that that moves ahead effectively. I think it's really important that it moves ahead in the right way and effectively. And then kind of beyond that, I think it's going to depend on the size of the surplus.
My caucus priority, I think, is going to be the business-to-business taxes, federal conformity, and then I think we'd like to make some fixes to the gift and estate tax. We think all three of those things are important. Beyond that, I think we'd like to see tax relief. When I was first elected in 2010 and sworn in 2011, we had a $6 billion budget deficit and zero in the reserves and zero in the cash flow account. And I know there was a bit of a standoff and a disagreement on how to handle that. But Republicans made some tough decisions in the budget that we put forth. And because of that, really, we have righted the ship and turned Minnesota's budget around, and frankly, helped to turn Minnesota's economy around. We refilled the cash flow account, refilled the reserve account. We almost completely paid back the school shift out of that Republican budget, and we did that through making tough decisions. And we knew if we raised taxes at that time, that would hurt the economic recovery that was already in place in Minnesota. So I would say that at this point, having money in the reserve accounts, I don't know that we necessarily need to increase those. We need to stop making the bad decisions that pulls the money out of those accounts. So I think that's probably the bigger key.
Senator Bakk?
Well, all of the state's bond rating agencies and all of our economic advisors have all been scolding us for years that the state's budget reserve is not adequate. It needs to be increased. So you'll see in the Senate an effort to increase the budget reserve. Other uses of one-time spending, and I don't want to sound like the Grinch, right? But my three colleagues here, if you listen to the bios, were not in the legislature in the 90s. Representative Carlson was, Senator Rest was. The first 7 years that I was in office, from 95 through 2001, you're not going to believe this because you don't remember what you did with it, we gave $10 billion back in tax relief. And the result of that was when the economy was really strong and the pendulum was over here, when the economy slowed down by 2002, when Governor Plenty got elected, he was facing over a $4 billion deficit. We had cut too far when the economy was really strong, and then when the pendulum rebalanced, we managed deficits for more than a decade. And I just will tell you, and I know whether it's in your home, your business, the youth hockey association you're in, the church you're in, any organization, if you are constantly in a state of crisis management, you cannot make good decisions about the future. So the Senate is going to be very careful in making decisions this session that put us in a position of slipping into deficit management again in the next biennium. So I think our preference for the reserve is to load as much of that money as we can probably into one-time spending so we don't have impacts in what we call the tails in the next biennium and beyond. And there are some very good uses for one-time money. So money for the budget reserve. I think we can enhance our capital investment, our bonding bill. If we've got some cash around, why would we borrow extraordinary amounts of money? Why wouldn't we use some of the cash we have rather than borrow to enhance the bonding bill? I'm going to talk to my caucus. I haven't yet, but there's strong support in the Senate DFL caucus for some money for transportation. Our transportation infrastructure is falling apart, and the legislature is having a difficult time, and the governor finding a way to get some new revenue into that. I think at a time when we've got some one-time surplus money around, maybe $300 million if possible, could be invested in our transportation infrastructure. And I know to people in this room that's important because I've heard from many of you about it. So I think there's plenty of good things to do with the budget surplus. The Senate is just going to be very cautious about repeating the mistakes that were made in the 90s that put us into a very tough decade of structural deficit management.
So, Senator Bakk, on that, does the Senate DFL have a number in mind, what they think the reserve should be brought to at this point?
No, I don't believe so. I think Senator Cohen, I believe, was on NPR probably yesterday. He's the finance chair. He probably will carry a bill on that. All three of our rating agencies have kind of different numbers. Some talk about a budget reserve as a percentage of your biennial spending. Some of them talk about a budget reserve based on annual spending. But I'm not looking for an extraordinary number that would bridge a catastrophic economic collapse. But what is important, the June accelerated sales tax I talked about is one of the mechanisms. You don't need a real large budget reserve if you have other accounting measures in place to help bridge economic downturns so that you don't, because we can't just turn taxes off and on, right? So you need accounting measures available. So when times are good, it's very, very important to pay back those accounting measures that you have so that you can use them kind of like a reserve, because you can turn accounting shifts on much easier than taxes. So paying back all of those different, some people call them budget gimmicks, I call them accounting measures, but paying those back when times are good are very important, because you don't have to have quite as big a reserve when you have those different kind of accounting maneuvers that the legislature can enact. And I realize they're probably not the best campaign rhetoric, paying those kind of things back. Cutting taxes or spending is much better campaign literature, but really for the fiscal health of the state, paying back those accounting measures so that future legislatures have those triggers to pull is very important.
So let's jump topics to minimum wage. So there was quite a bit of conversation last session regarding minimum wage. Again, this session, expect a lot of conversation around that. So let's talk a little bit about your position on raising the minimum wage, but then to what level and what provisions should be taken into consideration. So we've got quite a few members with the tip credit issue, for example, was a pretty big issue in consideration for them. So Speaker Thissen, let's start with you on this issue.
Sure, thank you. Well, the House passed a minimum wage at $9.50 an hour without a tip credit and with a inflator attached to it as well into the future. It's phased in over a couple of years, so you don't get to $9.50 right away. And we think that that's a very good and strong position to be in. I mean, the reality is a couple things. First, even at $9.50, someone that works a full-time job at $9.50 is likely, in most parts of this state, not bringing in enough money to actually raise a family on, right? And so most of those folks are going to have to work more than one job. That's fine. And another thing that's important about the minimum wage, people think it's for young kids, and the reality is probably 75 to 80% of the folks are either raising a family on the minimum wage or supporting themselves. They're older than 21 or 22 years old. And so this is not just about young kids, this is about families. And so we think that that's a position that we'll be in, and we want to get as close to that number as possible.
Representative Daudt, where will the House Republicans be on this issue?
Sure. I often give a speech about how you solve problems, and I was always taught with kind of a common sense in mind that you identify the problem first and then you work towards a solution. And I think this is the classic example of a solution in search of a problem. The actual statistic that the speaker was mentioning is that 60% of people that make minimum wage are 24 or under. This is something that will highly disproportionately affect youth. You'll have a much higher youth unemployment rate. I think the statistic is between 1% and 3% higher unemployment rate for youth for every 10% that you increase the minimum wage. Do the math. That's a big number. And unfortunately, in states that have raised the minimum wage, we have seen that there have been less jobs. And that's the ultimate end result of raising the minimum wage. What we need for Minnesotans is more opportunity. And Republicans in the House agree with the Speaker that lower and middle income Minnesotans need to make more money. But what we need to do is provide an environment in Minnesota where they have the opportunity and the job opportunities exist for them to get a better paying job. So that's the ultimate answer. In closing, raising the minimum wage simply just isn't fair to the Minnesotans that are going to lose their jobs because of it.
Senator Bakk, your opinion on this?
Well, how many of you were born or grew up in rural Minnesota, outside the 7 counties? Thank you. What you know that many other people in the room don't know is once you get outside this ring of 694 and 494, this state looks a lot different. And that's the challenge that the Senate has had as we've tried to figure out where we're going to land on the minimum wage, and I absolutely support raising it. There's a number somewhere between where the House and Senate are, and it may be the House's number that we land on. But there's another issue that's important in there is this group of small businesses that are currently at $625,000 in annual income. The challenging thing about being a member of the legislature and having a red and green button to push is it's very easy for people out on the street to advocate and rally, but they don't have to own the decision. But those of us that have to push that red or green button, we have to own the consequences, and we have to own the unintended consequences of that. So I think the challenge is making sure that that there aren't some unintended things that happen as a result of doing it, and I'll say it again, we're going to do that. But I think we need a couple of conference committee meetings, maybe 3, where we make sure we get the adequate testimony from all the different stakeholders out there that potentially can be impacted, so that when those of us have to make the decision to vote green, we want to make sure that to the extent we can have managed future impacts of it, that we've considered all of that.
Senator Hann?
I think Minnesota has one of the lowest minimum wages in the country. I think there are 3 or 4 other states that may be where we are. The surrounding states have the conformity to the federal level, which I think is 7.25, I believe. And that may make sense for Minnesota to look at that. I think, first of all, I will predict we'll see a higher minimum wage at the end of the session. That's my prediction. I'm going out on a limb. So I think the reality is...
Someone's counted the votes.
I think the reality is that we'll see something. I think, though, and Senator Bakk has alluded to this, there are some real concerns. I had a meeting last week. Representatives of the nursing home industry came, and they said, look, the way things work in Minnesota is nursing home revenue is entirely dependent on what governments provide in terms of reimbursement. And if you're going to bump the minimum wage up to $8.59, $9.50, whatever, we can't afford that. We have no way to get more revenue. It's against the law for us as nursing homes to charge people who can pay more money, for example. Can't do that. So we're stuck. So if you do that, then we are also going to ask you to increase the spending to pay for the increase in the minimum wage from the state budget. And I think, well, that's reasonable. I think that if we're going to do that, if we're going to raise minimum wages, and these are, nursing homes are not typically high-paying jobs, but it not only affects the people at minimum wage, but the people who are higher than that suddenly would be at or below the new minimum wage, there'd be a rippling effect. And I'm not sure what the cost to the budget would be, but I think that if we do that, we ought to be willing to pay for the increase that they are going to need to have to make that work. My question is, what about the small businesses and others that have that same effect? Who's going to pay their revenue increases? And of course, it's not going to come out of the state budget. I have real questions about this. Would it make any sense for us to say, well, let's increase the retail pricing of everything in the economy, goods and services, by 10%? Let's pass a law to do that. That'll generate more revenue for businesses than they could afford. Should we do that? Would people support that? I don't think so. I think as a legislature, we should be very cautious about mandating and setting prices. And a minimum wage is setting the price of labor. And we take a very heavy hand. We use a very, rough judgment when we do that, because every business has got to deal with a market, and we forget that sometimes. So I think to the extent that we do this, we should be prudent, we should be cautious, and we ought to recognize that smaller businesses in particular are faced with lots of things that make it difficult for them to adapt to a $9.50 an hour minimum wage, for example. What does that cost look like in terms of lost jobs or lost benefits to other employees in the business? I don't know, but we should be careful about that.
Thank you. Transportation. So we can't have a session without talking about transportation. We have a lot of transportation needs, obviously. We have conversations about having a comprehensive transportation bill. So what will transportation policy look like this year? And then personally, what is something within that package that you're personally committed to and wanting to move forward in that and the approach to that? So, Representative Daudt?
Sure. I've spoken on this a couple of, we do these events almost daily here before sessions, so we get used to seeing each other and we can almost give each other speeches. But
you can if you want.
Well, I offered to at the last event when the speaker was a little bit late. I said that I had been authorized to speak for him. So, transportation is certainly one of those priority things that state government, needs to provide for Minnesotans, and it needs to be a priority. And obviously, some of my comments in the past have been about the political realities of doing this in an election year, and I'll probably keep my comments a little bit there. I think that in a bonding bill, we would like to see the priorities in the bonding projects on infrastructure, transportation infrastructure, and other infrastructure projects that not necessarily on the frilly other things. So I think that's where we would like to see the priority on those types of projects. As far as a comprehensive transportation funding package this year, I'll wait and listen to what the majority members here have to say, but I think the realities of that in an election year are probably unlikely. I don't think that Minnesotans are ready to swallow a gas tax increase, whether it be at the wholesale level or at the retail level. The gross receipts tax, I think that they're talking about right now, will increase the price of a gallon of gas by 12 cents or more. I think that people feel like Minnesota's economy is recovering, but one of the things that, and everybody talks about the unemployment rate and how that's low right now, and while that is true, one of the statistics that I like to remind people of is that the underemployment rate in Minnesota right now is 49%, which means that 49% of Minnesotans are working at a job at a lower skill level or at a lower pay rate than what they're accustomed to. So while Minnesota's economy has recovered excuse me, let me restate that. While Minnesota's budget has recovered and the economy is recovering, it doesn't mean that Minnesota families have necessarily felt that in their pocket yet. So before we take more money out of Minnesota's economy for kind of permanent long-term increased spending, I think what we need to do is make sure we prioritize the money we're spending right now. Democrats put forth a budget this cycle that increased state spending by 10 or 11%, not spending, spending by 10 or 11% over the biennium. That's something that really is not sustainable on a long-term basis. So when we're talking about really making sure that we're managing the fiscal house of the state of Minnesota appropriately, it's interesting to see the things that we have prioritized spending money on, like a Senate office building. If our roads and bridges aren't in the best shape that they can be and should be, we shouldn't be looking at spending money on some of this other stuff. So our priority is making sure that we take care of the basics, which are the transportation needs, and not start worrying about some of this other stuff that really is not necessary. So, but the realities, politically, I don't think we're going to see a gas tax this year, but we'll let the majority leaders answer that.
So, Senator Bakk, is an election year, does that make it too challenging to have a transportation?
It's, the Senate's not on the ballot this year, so it's not an election year for us. But I can tell you in the Senate DFL caucus, we had extensive conversations last year about transportation infrastructure. All of the studies that I have looked at about what businesses consider when they want to expand or maybe relocate to your state, there are two things that stand out. One is, do you have the workforce that the business needs? And the second thing in every study I've ever seen is, what is your transportation infrastructure? Those are critical elements to economic growth. And we are falling down on the transportation side badly. And so against my counsel, last session, the caucus clearly wanted to vote for a gas tax increase. The train was leaving the station, so I thought, well, what can I do to slow this down? Because there is a golden rule of politics. You never vote for a tax increase that's not going to become law. And so I called the governor in, knowing the governor had objections. And the governor told the caucus, we are not going to sign a gas tax increase. We went up to the Senate floor and we voted for a gas tax increase. But, I give my colleagues credit for that. I mean, someone has to provide some leadership on this transportation issue. This is not going to fix itself, and it's not going to be free. So I was pretty proud of my Senate colleagues last year when they decided they were going to lead and we were going to have this conversation. So we weren't successful last year. I don't believe it's going to happen this year. I agree with Representative Daudt. I think it's very difficult for the House and the governor to do in an election year. But if I could give you one homework assignment as a business community, help us next year deal with this transportation challenge that we have. Because if we don't get it done next year in 2015, 2016 is an election year too. And then we're not going to talk about it until 2017 again. And I really think the only way we're going to make headway on transportation is if the business community gets engaged in it, in the conversation at the Capitol. So I think next year we're going to need your help on that. And I know this is a very, very active chamber that's got a lot of influence over at the Capitol. So if you could think about ways to help us move that issue forward next session. I can just tell you, none of us like to raise taxes. It's never fun taking a vote to take money out of people's pockets. But, and the gas tax polls is one of the worst. I also think nobody will lose an election over voting for a gas tax increase, because I do think the public understands the need for transportation improvements. They're going to grumble, and then they'll say, well, at least I know it's going to go to roads, because they do support the use of the money. So but we can't get it done without your help next year.
Senator Hann.
I think that my colleagues are right that there's not going to be a tax bill passed, an increase in the gas tax this year. I also agree that our transportation infrastructure needs attention, and I think we need to have that conversation. I think from our side, much of the concern centers around the priorities that we choose. I talked to some of the folks that were very supportive of the last gas tax increase, and they're very skeptical at this point because they're not clear on what happened to all the money. And so I think Senator Bakk is right that businesses are very concerned about infrastructure, but if they see increases in spending that somehow don't get translated into visible projects, I think that causes concern. So I think we want to look at the priorities. We think there does need to be a conversation about this. What that's going to look like, I'm not sure, but I don't believe we'll see any increase in taxes this year.
Speaker?
Well, I think everybody has pretty much summed it up, and so I don't know that I have that much more to add. I mean, the reality is there's a couple things. There is a broad coalition supporting a proposal to make an investment in transportation, and I don't think there's probably anybody in the state of Minnesota that doesn't think we need to make that investment. But there is one significant group that is not part of that broad coalition and is going to need to be part of the coalition before anything happens, and that's the Minnesota Chamber of Commerce. They were there in 2008, and they're not there now. And I think that that business community piece is fundamental. I also think when we passed it in 2008, it was a bipartisan bill. And I know that there's not going to be votes in the Republican caucus for a transportation package this year. I also think one other thing, and that is I don't think we've done enough work about looking at how we actually fund transportation. And partly it's about, what some of the things that my colleagues have said. Partly it's about asking the question, is the gas tax or a fuels tax, however you want to format that, think about that, is that a sustainable way to raise revenue for transportation into the future? We know that vehicles are getting more miles per gallon and a whole variety of things where the gas tax just structurally is perhaps not the most sustainable thing going forward. So I think there's also part of the discussion, it's not just about politics. I think there's a discussion around efficiencies that the chamber has raised that we need to look at. And I think that there are questions about what's the best funding policy if we're going to go forward, and perhaps the gas tax is not that. And so, that I think is where it's at. We're going to, I think that there's going to be a package not rolled out by Democrats, but rolled out by this broad transportation coalition, that we will obviously take a look at. But I think that as we move forward here, some of those other pieces need to fall in place before something happens that I think the state of Minnesota really does need.
Okay, let's jump to something around local governments, but the legislature needs to have a word on. So the TwinWest Chamber of Commerce supports object-based coding for local governments, which is a reporting method that provides greater transparency and understanding for taxpayers. So is this something that you would support legislation that requires this type of reporting? And
I've been around this a while. I have never heard that
I haven't
phrase.
either.
So
I have never. Who from local
whoever
government?
has that question, please come see me. I'd like to know more about it. But I mean, if there are ways to provide more transparency so that citizens know where money's being spent, certainly want to take a look at that. The whole truth in taxation process is not working very well. So there's got to be a better way to provide that accountability than what we currently have. And so I'm open to ideas.
We'll leave that there. But I need a lesson on what this is from somebody in local government, so that would be very helpful. Okay, so I have the microphone, so I get to throw out a healthcare question. So this could be long. No, I'm kidding. So I don't think I'm overly biased when I say that we have not had a very smooth rollout of MNsure, of the state exchange. I also think that it's also an issue that is very easy to make political rather than really looking at the policy piece of it. So let me just give you an example. The CBO report that came out. So this was looking across the country, and basically what it talked about is how many fewer jobs that there would be because of the ACA. Now there's two different ways, and typically the CBO is kind of untouchable. They're nonpartisan, they put their information out there, and there was two reads. One was job killer. ACA is a job killer. The other look at it was, you know what, people have been job locked because they have to have benefits. Now they don't have to have that. So somewhere in between, you know, is probably where that leads to. But what is the state legislature, are you guys going to jump into the fray of this session, just kind of see where things land? Where are your caucuses on this issue, and what, if anything, do you see the role of the legislature? So, you know what, we're going to start with you again, Representative Daudt, because the last one was a bomb.
Sure. The rest may not get a turn if we're going to talk about MNsure now. No, you know, this is something that obviously my caucus is deeply concerned about. We have not been happy with really any of it. And it's more than just the rollout. I know we talk about, oh, the website's not working, the call center's wait times are too long. That stuff can be fixed. The problem here is there's an underlying problem with the premise of MNsure in that the way that it's structured right now in the state of Minnesota, we're not getting the populations into MNsure, signing up for MNsure that we need to make it sustainable and make it really meet its goals. Its original goals were, you know, to provide more access at a lower cost. And frankly, it looks like now we may miss both of those goals. But you've got the wrong populations coming in at the wrong numbers, and the risk pool is going to be such that the rates are going to skyrocket over the next 12 months. And frankly, if we don't address that, you know, this thing just isn't going to get better by itself. And I hope that the legislature can step in. We have our Legislative Oversight Committee. Hopefully we can step in, and I hope that the majorities in the House and the Senate don't put their heads in the sand and hope that this problem goes away. We really do owe it to Minnesotans to take a look at this, not only look at the program itself, but look at the rollout. You know, we've got $26,000 worth of bonuses going to executives that oversaw this process at a same time when an independent report came out and said you're better off to start over from scratch than you are to fix what you've got right now. And if you do fix it, maybe $100 million, maybe 18 to 24 months to fix it. That's just the front end, the website, the call center, all of that stuff. That doesn't deal with the actual theories behind the populations that are coming in, the risk pool, all of that stuff. So my prediction is if we do nothing, we're going to see rates skyrocket. People are not going to sign up, and it's just going to continually get worse and worse. So we need to step in. We need to show leadership and really dive into this issue. And we probably need to do it on a bipartisan basis. And my caucus is willing to be at the table and help improve this as best we can.
Senator Bakk, your thoughts on this issue?
Well, I'm not aware of any legislation that's necessary relative to MNsure, but let me just say, all of us knew that Minnesota was not going to be a big beneficiary of the Affordable Care Act. Minnesota has a very efficient health care system, and we had 94, one of my friends on the 94% of Minnesotans were insured before the Affordable Care Act. And the point of the Affordable Care Act was to get people without insurance on insurance. And we all knew that it wasn't going to be a real successful benefit for Minnesota because we were better than almost all states in providing insurance to our citizens. The decision point was the Affordable Care Act was passed by the Congress. And are we going to just let the federal government write the exchange, or can Minnesota do better? And can we make a Minnesota model? And many people felt we can do it better in Minnesota than just defaulting to the federal government, including the State Chamber of Commerce. The State Chamber of Commerce wanted a Minnesota exchange. And like many of us, I tend to believe states can do a better job than the federal government can too on just about everything. So I'm not happy with the rollout of it all, but we're just going to have to give it some time to let it play out. But we're never going to have the kind of benefits in Minnesota that some of the other states like the Mississippis and the southern states that had real high rates of uninsured people are going to see tremendous benefits once this whole thing is rolled in. We're just not going to see the kind of gain. You need to remember the MNsure thing. We're only talking about, what's the number of Minnesotans, 5% or so, that will get their insurance through this. Most Minnesotans get their insurance through their private employers, or in the case of my mother, through Medicare, and aren't impacted by the exchange. It's a small number of Minnesotans that are really impacted by the Affordable Care Act and are going to get insurance through the exchange. Now, the implications on group policies for businesses have nothing to do with what we did in Minnesota. It has to do with the federal law. But this will be a very difficult campaign issue, I'm sure. I think people are going to try to make a whole lot of political hay with it, try to somehow distort the issues on it, probably on both sides of it. So you're going to hear an awful lot about this between now and November. And let me just, my caveat is, if I've said something that makes absolutely no sense at all, it's because I've never served on the Health and Human Service Committee, and I'm never going to.
You're a wise man, Senator Bakk.
Senator, you have served on those and led.
I did, and it was a very instructive opportunity that I had. When we were in the majority briefly, we get to decide what the committees are, and I'd never served on the Health and Human Services Committee, and so they made me chairman. And I was out of the room at the time, and I think, so at any rate, it was very instructive. I learned a lot. I think we tried to do some things that were of benefit. But I think on this issue, and I think Tom is right, there's a lot of rhetoric about this, and probably some of it is justified. But to me, there's some fundamental problems here, and the biggest one is that I think this law, the federal law, has really removed from us, the state of Minnesota, the people who represent the citizens, the power to act. And that is the most troubling thing. I mean, we're going to try to do things, we may differ, but we're all going to try to do things we think are going to benefit the people of the state. But when we are no longer able to do that with something as important as health care, that to me is a huge problem. We've done that. There recently was a letter that was sent off, Senator Lori and I think it was Representative Huntley in the House, and we on the Republican side also sent a letter to Kathleen Sebelius talking about the implementation of what they're going to do that's going to have a very negative effect on Minnesota Care, which has been traditionally a program that we have operated for low-income citizens in our state that is going to be practically destroyed by what's happening in the federal law. And we don't have anything we can do about it except beg for the federal government not to do what they're going to do. That, to me, is not right. And that was the thing for me that was most troubling about the federal law, is that they were coming in and going to force states to conform to some things that they, frankly, didn't have enough discretion to be able to manage state by state. And as Senator Bakk has pointed out, Minnesota may have been one of the leading states in the country on dealing with health care issues. I don't know that we're going to survive that. And I think the state of the federal law is such that I've heard there's something like 2 or 3 dozen provisions, major provisions of the law that the president has just decided on his own not to implement because of various things. So I think there's real questions about what does the law require now. There's all kinds of exceptions being made and things are being delayed, and it's all being done on the act of the president alone. That's not, to me, the way you want to have law, especially a law like this. I wish that we could, as a state, put up some resistance to this. The governor announced early on that he was all in. I think that was a mistake. I think we should have put up some skepticism and resistance that, look, we think we can do this better than you. If you're going to do it, then lead out on it, and if it makes sense, we'll go along with you. But if you're not going to make things better, then we're going to oppose it. And I think we ought to be very skeptical about continuing down this path. I don't know in the short term there's a whole lot we can do, except we can do some things with the governance model, for example. There were questions raised in the debate about this. I think we need stronger legislative oversight of the MNsure board, for instance, and the powers that they have. And I think we need to look at how we, maybe who's on that board, or how they get appointed, or how they get demanded. I think there are problems with the governing structure that need to be addressed. I think the provision that we gave them to become a active purchaser in the state which again, just serves to reduce the choices available. We ought to not do that. Maybe there's something in the statute that we could do this year to say, let's remove that power from that board so that they don't go down that path. So I think there's some things you can do in the margin in the short term, but long term, I think the federal government is going to have to give us some relief, and they're going to have to act. Otherwise, I think we're stuck.
Baker, any comments you want to make on this subject?
Sure. So first of all, I mean, clearly the rollout has been problematic, and that should be of concern to everybody. I do think, though, to kind of bring the discussion full circle, there actually has been some significant improvements in that, not related to what the legislature's done, but what the folks at MNsure have done. They have increased the call center staffing, and now those call center numbers are coming. The wait times, which were exceedingly long, especially at kind of these peak times when a lot of people are calling to register because there's certain deadlines in place. I think that with this addition of people to handle those calls, we should be able to keep the wait times down under 5 minutes and hopefully under 1 minute, and that's what the projections are, and it's actually moving in that direction. And 98% of people are currently now getting through the system, which is also a significant improvement from where it was at the beginning, kind of on the first time. And so some of those changes in the rollout are being fixed, and I imagine over time they are going to be fixed and accomplished. And although that's not obviously the full part of the story. And one thing I do want to do is thank the provider community in Minnesota, but particularly our health insurance companies in Minnesota, because they really have stepped up to the plate in a very significant way in helping MNsure and the MNsure board work its way through these problems. And that is one of the things that's actually made Minnesota one of the leading places for healthcare in this country, is that there is a collaborative spirit from the private and the public sector in solving problems. And so I think that really has been clearly a significant help to us. The MNsure would not be anywhere near even where it is right now without that help. The other thing I want to say about this, though, more generally, is that the goal, as people have said, of the Affordable Care Act, and more particularly what we've done here in Minnesota around it, is to expand access and make healthcare more affordable. And I actually think that, contrary to what some people have said, we have done that, and we shouldn't just be I have to disagree with Senator Bakk a little bit on this and others, that this is not just about making sure that people that were uninsured had insurance. That is an important part of it. And remember that 7%, or 8% I think it had gotten up to, is really, that's 400,000, 500,000 people in the state of Minnesota that didn't have insurance. So that's not an insignificant amount of money, or a number of people. And the thing that gets ignored as we talk about MNsure is that the expansion of Medicaid in this state covered several 100,000 people, separate from people going through the exchange. So we actually are making progress with the whole scope of the Affordable Care Act in Minnesota on getting those uninsured folks covered, and that just brings down the premium for everybody in this room who has insurance. It may not bring them down, but it lowers the increase that they're going to have. The second thing that's important is that it's the other 93%. There's a big group in that 93% who didn't have coverage that was really affordable to them or that was meaningful to them. So even though they were counted among the insured, because of very significant out-of-pocket costs, very significant co-payments, very significant deductibles, they didn't have insurance that was particularly affordable, or they were paying a very significant amount of money in premiums to get that coverage that far exceeded really a reasonable ability to pay for health care once you count the need for food, once you count the need for transportation, once you count the need for housing. The Affordable Care Act is actually helping on that as well in the exchange. Our premiums are the lowest in the country. And although we have, and one thing I guess the last thing that I would say about that is that there's about 100,000 people now that have gotten insurance through the exchange. They're actually buying a little more, not the cheapest policies, they're kind of buying up kind of the higher level policies to get some additional coverage. But because of the way that the law was set up, there's a lot, and because our premiums are so low, fewer Minnesotans qualify for federal subsidies. So there's a kind of weird dynamic there. Because we have the lowest premiums in the country, and because federal subsidies are based on the premium versus what your income is, we actually have fewer people who are qualifying for federal subsidies. What that means is a lot of people are going straight to Medica, they're going straight to Blue Cross, and they're not going through the exchange, but they're getting the benefit of those lower premiums. So even if it's far beyond the 100,000 people who are getting the benefit of those premiums, people who aren't going through the exchange but getting the benefit of what happened with that, because you kind of have to buy the same premium inside or outside the exchange. So when you're making a significant change in a very significant part of our economy, a part of our society as healthcare, there are going to be serious and significant bumps in the road. There's no question about that. From my perspective, and kind of to get to the question then, ultimately, there's two things that we need to focus on as a legislature. One is focusing on, okay, what is the next generation of this going to be? How can Minnesota make this better? And we are working on getting some waivers from the federal government and thinking about this more generally. But long term, our attitude ought to be, let's fix it and make it better, as opposed to just saying no to everything. Because I don't think there's really anybody in the state of Minnesota that thinks we ought to go back to the system that we had before. What we need to do is get a better system in place, because that system that we had before, for all the problems we have with MNsure, was not working for lots and, hundreds and hundreds of thousands of Minnesotans in this state. And the second thing that we are really focusing on as a legislature is on the constituent service side, making sure that people have the information that they need, helping people get through the system, helping make sure that people can take advantage of the new healthcare options right now that are out there. Anyway, that's kind of how I imagine that we'll be approaching it. I don't see that there's going to be particular legislative action around this year, but we need to continue to think about how are we going to improve our system in the state of Minnesota and continue to keep it among the very best in the country.
Thank you very much. Given our commitment to always end the program on time, I think we are going to, you want to do a question, Deb?
A couple questions.
Okay,
Quick.
we're going to do quick questions. We have 2 minutes, so here we go.
Good. Earlier this week, I attended a University of Minnesota Alumni Association meeting, and it filled the McNamara Building arena, so there were a lot of people, and you'll soon be getting postcards from us. My question is, President Kaler went through his request that he made, and then what Governor Dayton has proposed, and it's about 40 to 50% of what Kaler wants and the university. And you talked about transportation breaking down and antiquated, and you did mention Minskew, that there really are physical needs are needed for the university. Could you tell us how you feel about the university and its requests?
Well, go ahead, be a little quick.
As long as I'm the one that had breakfast with President Kaler earlier this week, and I've actually told the governor this, and I guess Paul's probably my witness when we had breakfast with him here a few weeks ago. I think the governor's HEPRA number is way too low. Now, HEPRA is not very flashy. HEPRA is maintenance on existing buildings that we own, heating, air conditioning, electrical. The university requested $100 million. The governor put $40 million in. I told the governor his number was way too low. I think out of the Senate you'll see us come with a higher HEPRA number for maintaining existing buildings as a priority, probably over building some new things. But politically, it's going to be difficult for us because now the governor has kind of put the stake out there that he supports all these new projects, and the legislature is going to have to pull back and say, no, we want to maintain some of the existing stuff we have before we build new things, both at the U and at Minskew. But I think in the Senate, that's probably the approach we'll be taking, is probably a little heavier on the HEPRA side than on the new side.
Does anybody else want to make a quick comment on that? Okay. I would like to just thank you for taking the time to be with